Hello, everybody, and welcome to our first part of our discussion of chapter 16, which is on the endocrine system. All right, before I get started, I wanted to hop over here to our Canvas and show you your week 6 to-do list. So this week, we are reading and talking about chapter 16, the endocrine system. We're going to see this in lab this week as well. Those slides that you saw last week that you didn't actually get a chance to examine probably, those will be available again this week on Thursday. So make sure that you check those out. I have some very limited description of that here. Basically, it's going to be various endocrine glands, obviously, specimens on slides for you to check out to basically identify some important cell types, but mostly what type of glands they are. To help with that, not only will obviously today's lecture be critical, but I have added a fun resource that I think I have mentioned earlier in the semester, but didn't know if you guys remember about Dr. Lee's histology lab. Definitely check this out. We've got a bunch of slides from various endocrine glands, endocrine organs. And these are really, really nice images that you can zoom way into and be able to check out a bunch of different cell types, which are pointed out to you in these slides. So very excellent resource, highly recommend. As always, I also have included your dynamic study modules for endocrine system for chapter 16, a couple of videos for you to check out. Definitely check those out. This PAL, Practice Anatomy Lab, this is in my lab in mastering as well. It's in the study section on the left-hand side when you go into my lab in mastering. There are a few different things going on here with PAL 3.1. So actually, if I go to my lab in mastering, I want to show you where this is at because this is really important and I think it'll be very useful for you. If you go into my lab in mastering, on the left-hand side, you will see the study area. Click through on there. Launch the study area in a new tab, not unlike your e-text, right? Here, if you scroll down, you see the Practice Anatomy Lab, or PAL. There's also flashcards that they make for you based on this stuff here. This whole deal, this study area, is awesome. You should be utilizing it. You should have been introduced to this in our first assignment, which was kind of a introduction to my lab in mastering. But the study area is great. This is the Practice Anatomy Lab, where you can look at stuff from various different species, including a human cadaver. So there is a little bit of human cadaver stuff in Pearson, which is pretty cool. If we are to look at the nervous system, you have a bunch of choices here, which is pretty awesome. It's basically a slideshow with a little bit of interactivity, right? So you can kind of identify, so we're identifying cranial nerves here, which is actually pretty awesome. So this is a pretty cool resource that I recommend you check out and that I do have linked in your to-do list. I'm very curious about this. I want to check this out. Oh, I see. Okay, so we're looking at the pituitary, maybe, yeah, no, maybe the pineal, maybe some other one. Anyway, there we go. Ooh, there we go. Very cool. So there is some nifty stuff, not as interactive as like Wiley, if that's what you're used to, but still very, very useful. Do launch the study area. Use these resources, you guys, okay? I swear it will be worth it. So that is in your to-do list along with your dynamic study modules, which are also there in that study area. That's the point of the study area. And next week, we're going to talk about the immune system. And then in week 8, we will have our second exams, at which point we will run away and enjoy a relaxing, socially distanced spring break, right? So let's get through the first half of endocrine system now, and then we'll have our second video as well. Just wanted to split that up for you guys. Make sure I'm not forgetting anything else here. What did I want to tell you? Make sure you go through everything in the to-do list, and that includes watching your videos, doing your dynamic study modules. Check out all these cool resources that I have for you. This is the very least amount of time and effort that you should be putting into the class. If you're worried about your exam scores, look here. Maybe look no further, but probably maybe look at least this far to your to-do lists for the weeks where we are covering materials that will be covered by the exam, okay? That is my best advice to you. All right, chapter 16, the endocrine system. So before we begin, let's talk about the endocrine system in context of the other body systems. It is a communication system, as is the nervous system, right? So the nervous system initiates very, very fast responses, right? So it's electrochemical in its signaling, right? Electrical, if you will, in its signaling, which means that it's very, very fast signaling, as opposed to the endocrine system, which is relatively slow. There are more steps involved, more different organs involved in the endocrine system, and you are depending on the movement of hormones, usually through the blood or through lymph or other bodily fluids, not electrical down nerves like with the nervous system. The responses of the nervous system are short duration, right? So you get that signal, you get a response like a muscle contraction, and then that's over if that signal was the only signal, right? Long duration responses are more the purview of the endocrine system, where basically if a hormone gets released into the blood and gets makes contact with its target organ, that response, whatever response is triggered by that hormone, may continue on for hours, if not days sometimes. The nervous system acts via action potentials. So again, this is electrical, and neurotransmitters, which is the chemical part of the electrochemical, right? So the acetylcholine or the norepinephrine that goes through that synapse between the neuron and the postsynaptic membrane of whether it be a neuron or an effector, right? And the endocrine system works with hormones, which are released into the blood or other bodily fluids. Nervous system acts at specific locations via like a highway, which would be like a nerve. Axon pathways, they start one place and they end in another place, and that's where the signal goes, and that's it, right? Whereas in the endocrine system, the hormones that are released by glands, they kind of diffuse, they go out into the blood, which means that they're going to basically pass by every organ. Whether or not they make contact with that organ depends on whether or not the organ has receptors for that hormone, right? But it could be multiple organs at that point, anywhere the blood reaches. And in the nervous system, neurotransmitters act over relatively short distances, and hormones act over long distances, right? So the neurotransmitters are just basically between the synapses, between neurons or between a neuron and its effector, that little gap in between the axon of the presynaptic neuron and the dendrite, if you will, or the cell body of the postsynaptic neuron. In the case of a neuron to neuron signal, that's as far as that neurotransmitter, the chemical part of electrochemical signaling of the nervous system, that's as far as it needs to travel, right? Whereas in the endocrine system, the hormones are traveling literally from a gland in the brain, possibly, right? All the way to maybe your kidneys, right? Or your ovaries or your testes. It travels a long distance. Okay, chemical signaling traveling a long distance. Within the endocrine system, right? So now that was my transition from the nervous system moving into the endocrine system. Here we go, right? So nervous system, we are done with you for now. The endocrine system is comprised of both of endocrine glands, okay, which is not to be confused with exocrine glands. All right, exocrine glands are not part of the endocrine system because they're not endocrine, right? Exocrine glands are glands in the human body that produce substances, not hormones, that are then secreted either into the lumen of a hollow organ or out onto the surface of the body, right? So remember, humans are a donut, right? That epithelial tissue of your skin originates from the same place as the epithelial tissue that lines your gut. So if we are releasing substances from an exocrine gland, we are doing that basically to the outside of the body, whether that be your skin or out into your digestive tract, which is technically in contact with the external environment, right? So your exocrine glands secrete non-hormonal stuff. They do it through a duct that leads to the technical outside of the body, which can be into a hollow organ or out into the skin. Examples of exocrine glands are salivary glands and sweat glands, right? So saliva and sweat are not hormones, and they are secreted either into the digestive tract or out onto the skin. Endocrine glands are different and weird. We talked about these two different types of glands a little bit in the histology portion of Bio 50A, so hopefully this is review for you. Endocrine glands secrete hormones. They secrete them into the blood or into tissue fluid or lymph, okay? Not onto the surface of the body or not out into the outside world, okay? They get secreted directly into the bloodstream and they don't need ducts to do it, okay? So while exocrine glands use ducts, your endocrine glands do not. From the gland, that substance is literally passed through an epithelial cell, probably a simple cuboidal epithelial cell. This stuff was going to come back and get you. I told you it would, right? It's going to be passed, the hormone will be passed through that cell via endocytosis and exocytosis. In other words, transcytosis, being passed all the way from one side of the cell and out to the other into a blood vessel, usually. Okay, so directly into the bloodstream that stuff goes. Your pituitary gland, your adrenal gland, your pineal gland, all of these, which we are going to talk about today, are examples of endocrine glands. Endo as in in, exo as in exit or out. Oopsie, got a little bit more of a lag today. I just never know. I just never know with this thing. That's okay. Just take my time. Endo. In, right? Okay. No ducts. Hormones directly into the blood. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about hormones and why they do what they do and what makes them hormones, right? So your hormones, well, I guess I should say when I say what makes them hormones, they can be molecules with a lot of different structures. They are hormones because they are secreted by endocrine glands, okay? I am actually kind of curious to know the etymology of the word hormone. I don't know what that is. But if it's secreted by an endocrine gland, then it is considered to be a hormone, okay? You have 4 basic types based on their structure. You have what are called amine hormones. These are all based on like what type of molecule they have or what type of subgroup they have attached to them, right? So amine hormones are ones that have this amino group attached to them, right? So peptides are going to be ones that have amino acids, right? Because amino acids are the smallest functional unit or the subunit of proteins, right? Which in other words is a peptide. A peptide is a protein. You've got short ones, which are considered to be peptides, long ones, which are called proteins. Okay, so peptide hormones are basically short chains of amino acids, while protein hormones are longer chains of amino acids, but still amino acids, since peptides and proteins are made of amino acids, right? We've got steroid hormones, which remember, these guys are kind of bizarre. You've got a lipid-based, so cholesterol specifically, right? Remember, cholesterol is a lipid. Steroids are a type of cholesterol. Testosterone and progesterone are both steroid hormones. Right? So these are all chemical messengers that travel, that are produced by an endocrine gland, within an endocrine gland, and then pass directly into the bloodstream. They travel through the blood until they basically reach a receptor that is shaped for them. So once they reach a receptor that's shaped for them, they just kind of lock into it. And once that receptor receives the thing that it's shaped for, one of these hormones, its ligand, right? Its specific ligand, that is what triggers internal changes in that cell of that organ, right? So depending on the shape of the hormone, that is going to be what the receptor's ability is dependent on, right? The receptor has an active portion, which is basically like a little hole, a little cutout with a certain shape to it. It's there to accept a specific ligand, like a specific hormone, because of its specific shape. Okay, these hormones can control a lot of different aspects of homeostasis. They can control different aspects of homeostasis in different organs, the same hormone. Okay, so the same hormone can have different effects in different organs. And it all has to do, again, with what receptors that organ has. Okay, so these hormones are going to control things like your metabolism, how fast your metabolism is, your growth, right? Human growth hormone controls your growth, your development as well, and other general aspects of homeostasis. All right. The endocrine system is literally a communication system, like we discussed, right? It's like the other communication system besides your nervous system. We are communicating from cell to cell. So literally from an endocrine gland cell to a cell of another organ via the bloodstream, okay? The communication between cells can rely on chemical signals like hormones, right? Or electrical signals like nerve impulses. The communication between cells can be, but right now, of course, we're talking about chemical signals, hormones. This communication can be local, as in like literally from one cell to the next. So once that signal reaches a particular cell of an organ, which the hormone reaches its target organ, the cells of that organ can communicate to each other via gap junctions, right? Like this. Remember, you've got basically like little passageways in between cells that are stuck together like an epithelial tissue. You can have direct contact dependent, like literally membrane-bound signaling proteins between two very, very close cells. If they actually come into physical contact, it takes just that touch for the two cells to communicate without actually passing something through. And autocrine signals, as in sending a ligand to a receptor. Okay, so these are local types of ways that cells communicate, and long distance ways that cells communicate is kind of where the endocrine system comes in. The sending of hormones from a gland in one part of the body to a receptor in another part of the body. That is the chemical way to do it. The electrical way to do it is the nervous system. Okay, so basically reiterating a bunch of stuff here, okay? Ways that cells are able to communicate to each other, whether they are right next to each other or whether they are farther away. So this type of signaling is really where the endocrine system shines. There it is, shining. Okay. So your endocrine system relies on chemicals being produced and being passed from a gland to a receptor in a cell, on a cell in the target organ. So this is long distance signaling that we're talking about, okay? All right, so once that signal reaches the receptor in the target organs, on the target organ system, or the receptor is actually in the plasma membrane of whatever cell that hormone reaches first in that organ, that hormone or signal molecule, also known as a ligand, is going to bind to the receptor protein in the plasma membrane of the organ cell, right? Signal molecule, ligand, in this case, is a hormone. The receptor, which is this guy here, is going to physically change shape. So remember, these receptors are proteins, right? Technically or specifically, they are enzymes, right? They're special proteins that help chemical reactions to happen faster, right? Once they receive that trigger, once they get that signal, which is that hormone fitting into its active site there, it's going to physically change shape. So the chemical reactions resulting from that will cause the conformation, that tertiary or quaternary structure of that receptor will physically change, and it will change on the inside of the cell. So it'll change actually on the inside of the membrane. Okay, it is that change that then allows it to communicate with the inside of the cell. Okay, it changes shape. It is sometimes able to now accept another ligand, which is floating around inside of the cell, maybe transform that into a different chemical, which will then go on and become a ligand for something else. It basically will cause a chain reaction inside of the cell and causing the cell to behave differently, right? That's the signal. We get the signal from the outside, we transfer that signal to the inside via the receptor changing shape, and then that signal gets passed on to something else, gets passed on to something else, gets passed on to something else, resulting in whatever that effector organ needs to do based on that signal from that endocrine gland, ultimately, okay? So the receptor is activated. The receptor activates more signal molecules on the inside, right? And the last signal in whatever that pathway is, that last domino in this chain reaction, is what is going to cause the response, that the ultimate final response to the hormone that left that gland, that endocrine gland, okay? So that's the actual technical reason that this works. Here's our little chain reaction, or maybe kind of more like a relay race, if you will. You're passing that signal on to other molecules, but that initial trigger for the organ to do something different or to do something specific came in the form of a hormone, which was produced and released by an endocrine gland. Okay. Within the cell, what that actual ultimate final response looks like is usually the cells of that organ producing a specific protein. Because again, like we learned in part A, proteins do everything, right? Proteins actually do the stuff. So usually what we're doing when we are causing that chain reaction, the ultimate response will be for the cells of that organ to produce a certain protein, which is basically proteins, remember, are what your DNA codes for, because proteins do everything. So once we can get the nucleus of every cell to be producing whatever protein will cause that organ to do the thing that it needs to do to respond to the hormone from the endocrine system, that is going to come down to the physical form of the new protein at the very end of that chain reaction, okay? So if they are received at the plasma membrane of the cell at a receptor, that's one thing. Either way, this chain reaction will ultimately lead to the production of a protein or the activation of a protein. Otherwise, if they just come in via diffusion, right, passive diffusion, they will find a receptor which is hanging out inside of the cell. Okay, so they might find a receptor on the plasma membrane, or they might diffuse in and find a receptor inside of the cells. Once they bind with that intracellular receptor, we're going to cause a particular gene sequence to be transcribed and translated, right? Transcription into messenger RNA and translated into a protein. Remember, transcription and translation from part A as well. Okay. Into protein, of course, right? Okay. So your endocrine glands, what causes them to produce and secrete these hormones, right? What is the signal to them to produce the hormone to go into the bloodstream, to go to the appropriate effector organs to cause a particular response to maintain homeostasis? What is that first signal? It can come in 3 different forms. Okay, so the signal can be what is called a humoral stimulus. So a humor is another word for a fluid. Okay, so extracellular fluid can also be referred to as a humor. Remember the vitreal humor of the inner eyeball, or the aqueous humor of the anterior chamber of the eyeball? Those humors are just fluids. Humoral stimulus is caused by a change in the chemical composition of a humor or a fluid. Okay, so in some cases, the endocrine gland just literally senses by means of like receptors on the surface of its cells. It can sense when the chemical composition of the surrounding extracellular fluid, the humor that the endocrine gland is sitting in or is bathed in, if that changes, sometimes the gland can detect that on its own, and then it's automatically triggered to release a particular hormone, okay? So, for example, if the calcium concentration in the blood of a capillary passing through the thyroid gland gets too low, then the thyroid gland will automatically release, it'll actually cause the parathyroid glands to automatically release parathyroid hormone, okay, PTH, which increases blood calcium levels by means of activating osteoclasts. So remember last semester, or whenever you took part A, we talked about the skeletal system. The skeletal system is involved in storing calcium and maintaining calcium homeostasis, right? If blood calcium levels get too high, then that excess calcium can be stored in bones, and it's up to osteoblasts to lay down that bony matrix and lay that calcium down to store it in the bones. But if blood calcium levels get too low, which is why it's important to supplement calcium if you're not getting enough in your diet, then osteoclasts become activated to degrade your bone tissue to pull that calcium out and deposit it back into the blood. So that level of calcium in your blood is one of those like homeostasis levels that is kind of set. And once calcium levels leave that set threshold, stuff gets triggered. And in some cases, it directly triggers an endocrine gland to respond. And that we call a humoral stimulus. A neural stimulus is a stimulus from the nervous system. So it's literally it's going to be the autonomic nervous system, right? Because this is something that's involuntarily controlled. It's not your skeletal muscle. This is a gland. So your central nervous system is going to send a signal down a nerve, and the effector is the endocrine gland, right? So that is a neural stimulus, comes from the nervous system. And a hormonal stimulus is one endocrine gland being activated by receiving a hormone from another endocrine gland, okay? So literally an endocrine gland that produces hormones may also be stimulated to produce those hormones by receiving a hormone from a different endocrine gland, okay? This happens a lot. We're gonna be talking about some of them. Your pituitary gland is an important one. This is the one that's like dangling there beneath your hypothalamus. We're going to talk about it here in a minute. But it releases hormones, at least from its anterior portion, that go off to activate other glands, further glands, your thyroid, your adrenal, and in this example, testes. Okay. So glands activated by other glands activated by the autonomic nervous system, and glands activated by chemical changes in the humor that they are bathed in. Humoral stimuli, neural stimuli, and hormonal stimuli. Okay. The cellular response to hormones. So remember we mentioned at the beginning that the nervous system has these short-lived effects, right? So that action potential reaches the effector organ or muscle. The organ or muscle does the thing in response to the neurotransmitter. And then that's it. As long as that signal stops being received, everything kind of resets. The endocrine system is different. Hormones and chemical signals react differently. They degrade differently, right? A physical chemical as opposed to a electrical gradient can linger. It needs to be broken down. So the response to hormones by the cells of your organs depends on how much of the hormone it receives, which makes sense, right? The blood level of the hormones. The amount of receptors, the number of receptors that the organ has for that hormone. So if an organ only has a relatively low number of receptors, it's only going to take up so much of that hormone, right? Whereas if it has a whole lot of receptors, then it's going to take up a lot more of that hormone. And how well the hormone binds to the receptor. So this is different, right? So some hormones bind really, really strongly to receptors. It's literally chemical affinity, right? So, you know, when you get back to the basic chemistry of it, we're talking about, you know, covalent bonds, for instance, right? You've got a transference of electrons or a sharing of electrons. Depending on which atoms, which elements are involved here, that sharing or transfer of electrons can result in a very, very strong bond that doesn't really want to let go, right? Whereas other things can be a little bit more passive. Hydrogen bonds are relatively weak. They let go easily. It just depends. It depends on the hormone and it depends on the receptor. Because what that connection actually is a chemical reaction, right? It's a bond. It's a chemical bond between atoms within those two large molecules. So how long the hormonal action lasts depends on, well, of course, how much of the hormone is there, which depends on how much was released, how many receptors you have, and how strongly they attach to the receptors. How long that duration is depends on those, but it also depends on the half-life of that hormone, which is basically just how long it takes for half of that first volume of hormone to degrade, okay? Kind of like the half-life of like a radioactive whatever, right? Just how long does it take for half of it to be gone, for it to be half as much as it was, because it's slowly degrading over time. So hormones do have half-lives. So how long it takes for the levels in the blood of that hormone to be cut in half. It depends on the chemical composition of that hormone, including whether or not it is water soluble or lipid soluble. So remember, we have molecules that can be hydrophilic or hydrophobic, right? You have molecules that are polar, they can be both, water molecules, right? Phospholipids, right? Phospholipids have a polar head and non-polar tails. They are what makes the plasma membrane. Remember these little guys? Right, each little phospholipid. So things that are non-polar can't get through the plasma membrane because they are repulsed by the non-polar tails of the phospholipids that make up the plasma membrane. And the polar stuff is soluble in water, right? So water soluble is basically like hydrophilic stuff, or stuff that has enough hydrophilic groups or arrangements of atoms in their molecule. And things that are lipid soluble, remember, water and oil don't mix, water and fat don't mix. So if it's soluble in lipids, then it's not soluble in water, right? Which means that it is hydrophobic, or it has hydrophobic subgroups, right? Hydrophilia is what it looks like I wrote there. This is not what I meant to write there. Hydrophilic. All right, hydrophilic versus hydrophobic. This is sort of like some review stuff to refresh your memory from last semester. It's all very important. So here are some examples of the half-lives of some common hormones. Amine hormones are relatively short-lived, 2 to 3 minutes. They also happen to be water soluble, right? So water soluble hormones like amines, they tend to be short-lived, okay? Short half-life. Thyroid hormones can last. This T4 hormone, which has only a slightly different physical structure than T3, has a much longer half-life, almost a week half-life for T4, whereas T3 is like less than a day. So weird. Polypeptides, large proteins, which are acting as hormones, relatively short. And proteins and steroids, again, relatively short to longer, depending on whether they have more of the hydrophilic or the hydrophobic, like side chains or groups attached to them, atomic molecules attached to them, right? So your lipid soluble hormones are going to be your steroids and your thyroid hormones. Your water soluble hormones are going to be your amino. And that's just, oops, just an example of water soluble hormones having a much shorter half-life than your lipid soluble hormones. Lipid soluble hormones have a longer half-life. They aren't broken down as quickly, basically, right? Or they aren't cleared from the blood as quickly. So water soluble hormones are going to get filtered out by your kidneys, the same as anything else that dissolves in water or in blood will be pulled out by the kidneys, right? Your kidneys are constantly filtering your blood. If it's lipid soluble, it might actually end up like in the adipose tissues of your body, which means it's not going to be cleared out as fast, right? Okay. Your lipid soluble hormones, again, you're going to be bound to your plasma proteins, so they're not going to be easily filtered by your kidneys, whereas your water soluble hormones are kind of free floating in the blood, so they can be filtered out. Relatively long half-life for your lipid solubles and relatively short half-life for your water solubles. That's really what I'm trying to drive home here, okay? Is the half-life. All right. Your hormones also interact with each other when they are released. So not only do they interact with the next gland or whatever effector, whatever the end of that chain reaction is, they also react with each other. So if a hormone is released from one gland and a hormone is released from another gland at the same time, and they find each other in the blood, they may actually have some sort of an interaction that's on purpose and is important for maintaining homeostasis. Really, really interesting. Some are synergistic, which means that they are greater than the sum of their parts. So literally the effect of one hormone is this, the effect of another hormone is this. But when you put them together, it's not just the resulting additive effect is actually greater than what you would expect based on the effects of each one by themselves. So additive or synergistic effects, such as this, when all three of them are there, look at how much stronger they are working together in terms of increasing blood glucose levels compared to each one of these things on their own, right? So that's synergy. That is, their effects are greater even than what you would expect if you just added them together. Permissive effects, basically one will, if they're both there, they will basically continue to allow each other to operate. Sometimes one will shut the other one down, but it's not quite as, it's not as antagonistic, which is opposing effects, okay? So basically you have synergistic where they work together. You have antagonistic where they literally have opposite effects. So one might be activating and the other might be inhibiting or inhibitory. And then you have permissive, which is where like they're both are operating either independently and they don't bother each other, or worst case, one will like shut the other one down, which isn't necessarily the same thing as inhibiting anything. It's just this one takes priority and this one is gonna like hang back and not do anything, okay? So the second hormone may not function in the system. Okay, so you need to know the difference between synergistic hormone reactions, permissive hormone reactions, just generally, versus antagonistic hormone reactions. Synergistic, they work together, their effect is greater than the sum of their parts, which means that they are more than additive. Permissive means that they either ignore each other or one might cause the other one to not work. And antagonistic means that one is literally canceling out what the other one is doing. Okay, so they have opposing opposite effects. Okay. All right. Your hormones operate in feedback loops. So remember from part A, we talked about both negative and positive feedback loops. Here are some more specific examples regarding the endocrine system specifically. So when you eat something and it reaches your stomach and your small intestine and your body starts to break that food down and put it into the bloodstream, these complex, or I guess in the case of a hamburger bun, more like simple carbohydrates, but the white bread gets broken down into glucose molecules, right? So it's those glucose molecules that are transported into the blood from your small intestine. Once that glucose blood level reaches a certain threshold, we are going to activate, or it's going to be detected by cells of the pancreas, which is this guy right here, which is technically an endocrine gland, okay? So the pancreas is going to recognize that blood glucose levels are going up. The pancreas secretes insulin. The insulin tells the liver to take up that glucose and store it as glycogen. So remember, glycogen is that energy molecule that we use. We talked about it in the muscular system in part A. It is it's kind of an intermediate source of energy for when you're doing moderate exercise, right? So that's what we do with glucose. We store it for later energy, right? So your liver is in charge of taking that glucose up out of the blood and transforming it into, basically transforming that energy from kinetic energy into potential energy in the form of a glycogen molecule, right? We're going to store that energy in those chemical bonds. Once the glucose is taken up, the glucose levels in the blood decline, and the insulin levels that the pancreas produces go down, leading to a return to homeostasis. Return to homeostatic blood glucose levels. Okay, so basically the system activates based on a signal, but once we return to homeostasis, it shuts itself down. Okay, negative feedback loop. That looks not how I wanted it to. Sorry, I'm extra perfectionistic today. I'm not sure what that's about. Okay. Versus a positive feedback loop where, for example, you would have suckling at the breast, right? That stimulus, that's actually the stimulus, the physical stimulus, triggers the hypothalamus to signal the posterior pituitary, which is the back part of the pituitary gland, to release oxytocin. Oxytocin causes the mammary glands to produce more milk and to eject the milk, right? So we are sending a signal to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus signals the posterior pituitary to release oxytocin. Oxytocin gets released into the bloodstream. And when it reaches the cells of mammary glands, it stimulates them to eject milk. That milk released reaches the baby, and then the baby is happy, and then it keeps suckling, right? And then we just keep going round and round and round. Positive feedback loop. The positive feedback loop ends when the initial stimulus goes away, okay? So rather than the end stimulus shutting off the initial stimulus in a negative feedback loop, that final stimulus actually causes the initial stimulus to go stronger, and we go round and round again. Once the baby detaches from the nipple, that initial stimulus is gone, okay? Baby gets full and detaches. All right, so let's get into some of the anatomy of the endocrine system. Let me make sure that haven't gotten too far ahead of myself here. Oh, actually, this is perfect. I'm gonna end here, and then I will pick up right where we left off with the anatomical overview of what glands and organs are part of our endocrine system, okay? So that concludes part 1 of chapter 16. Stay tuned, and we will continue here shortly.